In 1909, the Milwaukee Road completed the last transcontinental railroad ever built in America, without a single acre of free government land. 70 years later, the railroad's own trustee tore that same line out of the ground, a decision built on numbers that were dead wrong. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what that decision was and why it doomed the most valuable part of the railroad. You'll recognize the same pattern happening right now in the fight over the Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern merger. But first, go back to 1905 to President Albert Erling, pushing his railroad toward a gamble no one dared make. Erling wasn't gambling for fun. He was cornered. Every other major railroad in the northern United States already had a door to the Pacific Ocean. Great Northern had one. Northern Pacific had one. Union Pacific had one. The Milwaukee Road, for all its size across Wisconsin and the upper Midwest, stopped dead at the Missouri River. If it wanted freight from the Pacific Northwest, it had to beg a competitor to hand it over. That's not a railroad, that's a tenant. So in 1905, Erling's board did something almost nobody else in American railroading was still doing: build their own way to the ocean, from scratch, through 5 mountain ranges with no free land to help pay for it. Every earlier transcontinental had land grants. The Milwaukee Road got nothing. It paid for its own dream, mile by mile, in debt. Now, if you already think you know how this ends, trucks took the freight, cars took the passengers, railroads got old and died, you're not wrong. That happened to almost every American railroad. But most of them survived it. The Milwaukee Road didn't. Something else was going on underneath the obvious story, and it started decades before diesel trucks were ever a real threat. The company that would become the Milwaukee Road started small, almost accidentally small. Chartered in 1847 as the Milwaukee and Waukesha Railroad, it was a short local line connecting a lake port to a farming town a few miles inland. Its first train ran roughly 5 miles. Not a transcontinental ambition in sight. Just a Wisconsin company trying to move grain faster than a horse could. Over the next few decades, under a banker named Alexander Mitchell, that little line absorbed smaller railroads until, by the 1870s, it had a real name, the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railway, and a real footprint across Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa. By 1890, it pulled in over $26 million a year, running more than 5,000 miles of track. On paper, one of the healthiest railroads in the country. But this wasn't really a railroad building story. It was a dependency story. The company had grown into a large, financially solid regional carrier that couldn't move a single boxcar to the Pacific without another company's permission. Everyone thinks the Pacific extension was ambition. It was actually an escape plan. At the turn of the century, the Northern Rail map was carved up among a handful of giants. Great Northern and Northern Pacific, controlled by railroad titan James J. Hill and his allies, already owned Puget Sound. Union Pacific held its own southern route through the Rockies. If you were a Midwestern railroad chasing freight out of Seattle or Tacoma, you handed your cargo to one of those companies at some interior junction and hoped they treated you fairly. The Milwaukee Road was permanently at somebody else's mercy, and Erling's board decided they'd rather owe a fortune to bondholders than keep owing favors to Jim Hill. So they built, fast. Between 1906 and 1909, construction crews pushed a new main line through South Dakota, Montana, Idaho, and Washington, across the Belt Mountains, the Rockies, the Bitterroots, the Saddle Range, and finally, the Cascades. The last spike went in near Garrison, Montana, in the spring of 1909. By July, through freight was running all the way from Chicago to Tacoma. This should have felt like victory. And for a while it did. The Milwaukee Road had built the last transcontinental railroad the country would ever see completed from scratch. No government handed them the land. No merger handed them the route. Then they did something even more audacious. Starting in 1916 and finishing by the late 1920s, they electrified over 650 miles of their mountain divisions, running electric locomotives instead of steam through the hardest grades in the system, the largest stretch of electrified mainline in the United States. Trains that once needed steam helper engines to crawl over the passes now ran cleaner, cheaper, and faster on hydroelectric power. The fleet eventually grew to more than 100 electric locomotives, including a set nicknamed the Little Joes, originally built for the Soviet Union and rerouted to Montana instead. This wasn't a side project, it was a statement. For a moment, the Milwaukee Road was out-engineering Great Northern and Northern Pacific. Then came the Hiawatha. Launched in 1935, it was a streamlined Art Deco passenger train built to run between Chicago, Milwaukee, and the Twin Cities faster than anything else on rails. On a test run that same year, a Hiawatha steam locomotive hit 112.5 miles an hour, one of the fastest speeds a steam engine had ever reliably recorded. Trackside signs warning engineers to slow back down to 90 became a kind of running joke among railroad crews because everyone knew the Hiawatha rarely listened. The company once stuck, begging for access to the Pacific, was now running one of the fastest, most modern passenger trains in America. For a couple of decades, this looked like proof the gamble had paid off. The public saw speed records and glamorous new engines. What the public didn't see was the balance sheet. Building nearly 1,500 miles of railroad through mountain terrain with no land grants was never going to be cheap, but nobody planned for how expensive it would actually be. The original estimate for the Pacific extension was around $45 million. The real cost, once electrification was factored in, came in somewhere north of $200 million. That's not a budget overrun. That's a different project entirely. And the company had already committed to paying for it before it understood what it was buying. This wasn't ambition. It was a bet the company could never fully repay, made when nobody in the room was willing to say so out loud. That bet came due almost immediately. In March of 1925, the Milwaukee Road filed for bankruptcy, at the time one of the largest corporate bankruptcies in American history. This is where people get the timeline wrong. Most retellings treat the collapse as a 1970s story about trucks and oil embargoes and a company that simply outlived its usefulness. It wasn't. It started dying in 1925, less than 2 decades after the Pacific extension was finished, when traffic on the new line never matched what the bond payments demanded. The 1914 opening of the Panama Canal didn't help either, giving shippers a cheaper way to move goods by water. Ships could now undercut the railroad's own long-haul rates on the exact routes the Pacific extension had been built to dominate. This wasn't a stumble. It was proof the railroad had built something bigger than it could ever pay for, and everything that came afterward happened inside a company that was already structurally underwater before most of its most famous achievements even occurred. The company survived that 1925 bankruptcy through reorganization, and a second bankruptcy in 1935 when the Depression gutted freight and passenger revenue industry-wide. It kept running the Hiawathas. It kept electrifying. It kept looking, from the outside, like a serious national railroad. But the debt from that original gamble never fully went away. And the competitive world around it wasn't standing still. Great Northern and Northern Pacific had been rivals for decades, but in March of 1970 they merged with the Burlington into a single giant called Burlington Northern. 3 competitors became one enormous system that surrounded the Milwaukee Road on nearly every route it ran in the Pacific Northwest. The company that had once disrupted the old rail map by building its own way to the ocean was now the smallest, weakest player boxed in by a rival 10 times its size. This is the part the trucks and cars version skips. The Milwaukee Road had spent years trying to solve this problem the same way its rivals had, through merger. It had counted on combining with the Chicago and Northwestern since the mid-1960s. In 1969, federal regulators effectively blocked that deal, even while approving the much larger Burlington Northern merger at the same time. When Burlington Northern formed anyway, the Northwestern's owners came back and offered to sell themselves to the Milwaukee Road outright. Chairman William John Quinn turned it down. He believed the company needed a bigger partner, not a smaller one, and tried to get folded into other pending merger cases instead. Regulators said no to those too. By 1977, the door to almost every merger option had closed. While that played out in boardrooms, something quieter and more damaging was happening on the actual railroad. Starting in the mid-1960s, the company began deferring maintenance, delaying repairs, patching instead of replacing, partly to make earnings look healthier to potential merger partners and regulators. It was quietly trading its future condition for a better-looking present, and the bill was still coming. It was the same pattern that had already crippled Penn Central a few years earlier, deferred maintenance dressed up as good bookkeeping, until the tracks themselves couldn't hide the truth anymore. Then in 1973, leadership made a decision that still baffles railroad historians. They announced they were shutting down the electrified mountain divisions. The same 650 miles of wire that had been one of the company's proudest achievements and one of its genuine cost advantages. By 1974, the last electric locomotives had made their final runs. Replaced by new diesels, the company spent roughly $40 million to buy. General Electric had reportedly even offered to help finance modernizing the aging electrical system instead. The company said no. Months later, the 1973 oil embargo hit, and diesel prices spiked nationwide. This wasn't cost-cutting. It was trading a cheaper engine for a more expensive one, right before that engine's fuel exploded in price. The Milwaukee Road had built itself an alternative decades earlier and had just finished ripping it out. By the mid-1970s, roughly 4,000 miles of track, nearly 40% of the system, were under speed restrictions, too deteriorated to run trains at normal speed. You don't get conditions like that by accident. You get them by choosing, year after year, not to fix things. Transit times from Chicago to the coast, once a little over 2 days, stretched to nearly 6. Shippers who needed reliability went elsewhere. Every rerouted shipment was one more customer the railroad wouldn't get back, even if conditions later improved. In 1976, the company made one last attempt to get folded into Burlington Northern. Regulators denied it in March of 1977. 9 months later, in December, the Milwaukee Road filed for bankruptcy a third time. None of these problems alone would have been fatal. A company can survive heavy debt. It can survive losing a merger fight. It can even survive an expensive equipment mistake. What it can't survive is all of it landing at once, with no reserves left to absorb the next hit. One of these would have hurt. All of them together left no room to survive. And this is where the story gets genuinely strange, because the ending wasn't really about running out of money. It was about a decision built on numbers the company got wrong. After the 1977 bankruptcy, Trustee Stanley Hillman brought in consultants from Booz Allen Hamilton to study the railroad and figure out what to save. Their 1979 recommendation was blunt: shrink to a compact Midwest core and cut loose almost everything west of Montana, including the original Pacific Extension, the exact line the company had bet its future on in 1905. Here's the part that should stop you cold. When the Milwaukee Road filed to abandon those western lines, its own numbers, reviewed by federal regulators, showed the Pacific extension, the so-called Lines West, had actually been profitable in 1976, 1977, and 1978. Profitable, 3 years running. At the exact moment the company was arguing in court, it needed to tear the whole thing up because it was losing money. Later review of the company's accounting found expenses tied to that western section had effectively been counted twice, making the most valuable part of the railroad look like the biggest drag on it. This wasn't a business decision. It was a railroad destroying its own most valuable asset over a number it never checked carefully enough before it was too late to undo. The legal machinery moved fast. New federal legislation shifted authority over the abandonment straight into the bankruptcy court, speeding everything up. In February of 1980, the judge approved an embargo on operations west of Miles City, Montana. Washington State Service stopped 2 days later. On March 15th, the last train out of Tacoma pulled out on what railroaders called Extra 5802 East, the final run over track the company had spent 3 brutal years building 70 years earlier. What followed wasn't a slow fade. It was demolition. Through the early 1980s, crews physically tore up close to 2,000 miles of railroad west of Miles City, pulling rails, ties, and ballast out of the ground across Montana, Idaho, and Washington. It remains the single largest rail line abandonment in American history. This wasn't decline. This was a decision executed in a matter of months, on a scale nobody in the industry had ever seen. What was left, a smaller network running through Chicago, Milwaukee, the Twin Cities, Kansas City, and Louisville, actually turned a modest profit within a couple of years, under new trustee Richard Ogilvie, the former Illinois governor who guided the shrunken company toward a sale. In February of 1985, the court approved a purchase by the Soo Line, a Canadian Pacific subsidiary. On January 1, 1986, the Milwaukee Road officially merged into the Soo Line, and a name that had been on locomotives and Wisconsin paychecks for over a century quietly disappeared from the map. The brand did not collapse in some dramatic final scene. It was absorbed, filed away. The company did not fall behind the times. It dismantled itself mile by mile on purpose, based on a decision built on flawed math. And what survived afterward was not really the Milwaukee Road anymore. It was just the parts of it someone else still wanted. A brand surviving is not the same thing as a system surviving. For the towns along that torn-up western route, the difference was not abstract at all. Harlowton, Montana, once a division point and a hub for the very electrification the company had been so proud of, lost its rail lifeline almost overnight. Ringling, Montana lost it. Lombard, Montana, a small settlement built around the railroad, essentially became a ghost town. More than 20 communities across Montana lost their connection to the national rail network in that single abandonment. Grain elevators, timber operations, and mining shippers that had depended on that line for affordable access to markets suddenly had none. Many of those communities were already losing local branch line service to larger, unit train-focused competitors. The Milwaukee Road's exit did not create the problem so much as finish it. Over 11,000 employees were on the payroll at the 1977 bankruptcy. By the time the dismantling finished, thousands of those jobs organized around schedules, shifts, and specific stretches of track simply did not exist anymore. A canceled route is not paperwork. For a grain town on a branch line with no other way to move its harvest, it is the difference between staying connected to the country and quietly disappearing from it. Some of those towns really did start disappearing once the train stopped. Today, if you want to see what is left, you look for a trail, not a railroad. Long stretches of that abandoned right-of-way have become hiking and biking routes. The Palouse to Cascades Trail across Washington state, cutting through the old Snoqualmie Tunnel. The route of the Hiawatha through the old Bitterroot Mountain tunnels in Idaho and Montana, named, a little ironically, after the same fast passenger train that once made this company famous. People now walk and bike through mountain passes that freight cars once crossed in the middle of the night, hauling grain and lumber toward Seattle. So what actually destroyed the Milwaukee Road? Not trucks, not cars, not simply old age. The evidence points to a company that overextended itself building a transcontinental line it could barely afford, spent decades deferring the maintenance that debt made hard to justify, made a catastrophically timed decision to rip out its own cheapest source of power right before fuel prices spiked, and finally backed into a corner, tore up the one part of the railroad its own numbers, checked properly, would have shown was actually working. Historians still argue how much of that is management failure versus a region that couldn't support three competing transcontinental railroads forever. That argument doesn't fully resolve, but it doesn't change what the company's own filings show. The decision to abandon lines west was made on numbers that were wrong, and there was no time left to correct them before the tracks were already gone. That's the trap underneath this whole story. The same audacity that let a landlocked Wisconsin railroad outbuild three richer, better connected rivals to reach the Pacific is the exact debt that never stopped squeezing it for 70 straight years until the people running the company chose to tear down what they'd built rather than find a way to fix it. And that question, how many transcontinental railroads a country can actually support, and who gets stranded when the answer shrinks, didn't retire in 1980. Right now, Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern are trying to build what they're openly calling America's first true single-line transcontinental railroad, built on the same logic that sent the Milwaukee Road west in 1905. Whoever controls the route from Chicago to the Pacific has the power, and everyone else lives with whatever access they're given. Rival railroads, farm groups, chemical shippers, and rail unions are already pushing back, warning regulators about captive shippers losing competitive options. Federal regulators are still reviewing the deal, weighing billions of dollars in projected savings against warnings that fewer competing railroads means less leverage for everyone who isn't the railroad. Nobody knows how that story ends, but the mechanism is the same one that quietly killed a company a century ago, the belief that owning the whole route solves the problem, when sometimes it just moves the problem further down the line. The Milwaukee Road is the closest thing American railroading has to a cautionary tale for exactly that belief. The Milwaukee Road didn't lose the race to the Pacific. It won that race faster and more completely than almost anyone thought a landlocked Midwestern railroad could. Then, 70 years later, its own leadership tore up the finish line with their own hands. If you want more of these forgotten American collapses, hit subscribe. There's a lot more track like this to cover. If you ever rode the Hiawatha, or your family came from one of the towns the Milwaukee Road left behind in 1980, tell us in the comments. Did anyone ever explain to you why the trains just stopped coming?